is dedicated to transportation planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, resilient, and connected region. More information available at northfloridatpo.com. Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.
After the day's news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Corva Coleman. President-elect Donald Trump's choice to serve as head of the Drug Enforcement Administration is withdrawing his nomination. NPR's Brian Mann reports Chad Chronister is a county sheriff in Florida.
Trump tapped Sheriff Chronister to lead a massive drug-fighting organization with field offices and agents around the globe, but the nominee had little experience managing a complex organization like the DEA. Now Chronister has withdrawn from consideration, writing on social media, quote, "As the gravity of this very important responsibility set in, I've concluded that I must respectfully withdraw." As sheriff of Hillsborough County, which includes the city of Tampa, he angered some Floridians by enforcing COVID-era lockdown rules. Trump also saw his first nominee for U.S. Attorney General, Matt Gaetz, step aside after a sex scandal appeared to cost him support among Republican lawmakers. Brian Mann, NPR News, Washington.
Another strong wintry storm system is plowing into the U.S. from Canada. It could bring blizzard-like conditions to areas from Michigan to Maine. National Weather Service meteorologist Brian Mitchell says that includes gusty winds.
It's going to be a quick burst of snow, and the temperature's going to drop fairly quick. Visibilities will be low, and winds gusting up to 45 miles an hour at times. So it's going to be bad briefly, but it's going to be hazardous travel conditions certainly with that.
Parts of western New York State near Buffalo have gotten nearly 5 feet of snow already. Forecasters say up to 20 more inches of snow could now fall. There are protests underway in South Korean cities, including the capital, Seoul. This comes after South Korea's president, Yoon Suk-yeol, withdrew his order yesterday for a declaration of martial law. The South Korean parliament unanimously voted against his declaration, and Yoon pulled back the order. Now the lawmakers are moving to impeach him. Protesters aren't waiting. They're demanding Yoon's immediate resignation. Investigators say that Russia's president and top Kremlin officials approved sending more than 300 Ukrainian children into forced Russian foster care and adoptions. NPR's Joanna Kakissis reports the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab says there's evidence of more war crimes.
The International Criminal Court has already issued a warrant for the arrest of Russian President Vladimir Putin on alleged war crimes for his role in the deportation of Ukrainian children. Nathaniel Raymond, executive director of the Humanitarian Lab, says Russian foster parents or guardians can apply for Russian citizenship on behalf of Ukrainian children in their custody.
This is extremely important because now it basically creates a method by which their Ukrainian identity can be erased.
The researchers confirmed dozens of the children have already been assigned Russian citizenship. Joanna Kakissis, NPR News, Kyiv.
You're listening to NPR News.
And you're listening to WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. Good morning, I'm Stephen Ponson. It's 9:04. An update on the Emerald Trail's Riverside Link will happen tomorrow evening. The Groundwork Jacks team will preview designs and offer information about the route, which will include areas around the Artist Walk, Fuller Warren Bridge, and the Riverside Arts Market. The meeting is scheduled for 6 tomorrow evening at the Jacksonville Association of Firefighters building on Stockton Street. The head of the Regional Federal Reserve Bank says the economy heading into the new year is on solid footing. However, Tom Hudson reports there's less certainty about continuing to lower interest rates.
Raphael Bostic is the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. His region includes Florida. Central bankers, including Bostic, have cut their target interest rate twice since September.
I did so because the risk of inflation remaining troublesome has fallen, and the risk that employment might become a problem spot has increased.
In his quarterly policy essay released this week, Bostic describes both inflation and the job market as, quote, broadly healthy. He still thinks inflation will return to a much more comfortable level of 2%, But he cautions there are pockets of more stubborn price hikes, especially in housing and services like healthcare. So there's no guarantee that the Fed will continue to lower interest rates.
A continuation of the positive string of macroeconomic events is not assured, as uncertainties surround both the labor market and the continued decline of inflation towards the committee's 2% goal.
The Fed's next interest rate setting meeting is in 2 weeks. I'm Tom Hudson in Miami.
Highs in the lower 60s this afternoon.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Capital One, offering their premium travel card, Venture X. What's in your wallet? Terms apply. Details at CapitalOne.com. And listeners like you who donate to this NPR station.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
Good morning. I'm Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today, the new Cold Wars. We talked to New York Times reporter David Sanger ahead of his appearance here tonight on global security concerns, cyber hacks, and an increasingly contentious global landscape. Later, Steep Canyon Rangers bassist Barrett Smith explains why the Florida Theater is one of the bluegrass band's sweet spots. But first, in his more than 40 years at the New York Times, David Sanger has covered the White House, national security, geopolitics, and cyber conflict. He's been part of reporting teams that won 3 Pulitzer Prizes, covered 5 presidents, and authored 4 books. The most recent of those is New Cold Wars, China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West. That's one focus of his appearance tonight at the University of North Florida. David Sanger, thank you so much for being here.
And great to be back here in Jacksonville.
We're also joined by Britt Hester. He's Director of Communications for the World Affairs Council, which is hosting David Sanger's appearance. Hey, Britt.
Hey, Ann. How you doing?
Great. So, David, you are known as a reporter for the depth of your sources in the world of national security, for your in-depth investigations, your research, and you cover what I think of as probably one of the hardest beats in reporting, not just because of the usual challenges that go with reporting, but because the stuff that you're covering is supposed to stay super secret. It is, behind walls of national security, harder probably than most to get off the record or on the record comments.
Ann, first of all, what we're covering is how America operates in the world, a world of competition, a world that involves dealing with Russia and China and Iran and North Korea and our allies, some of whom are contentious, some of whom are democracies, some of whom have days like South Korea had yesterday. And so while some of that involves classified material, really the big, broad categories of what we're doing don't. They're visible to you. The machinations behind the scenes which illustrate what's going on, they may be harder to collect and report on, and that's the test of one's sources. But you should never overemphasize the importance of classified information, because just because it's secret doesn't necessarily mean it's important. And just because it's important doesn't necessarily mean it's secret.
Your sourcing is well respected, and your interviews, you're talking to congressional people, congressmen, academics, foreign leaders. I've seen it said that you are the sort of national security and foreign policy writer whom politicians, diplomats, intelligence, and defense officials read not only to check their own quotes, but to find out what's really happening. That must be an enormous responsibility to know that you're delivering to some of the most powerful people in the world news to them.
Well, I wish I could say that was like all about me. It's not. It's about the fact that I've worked for now 42 years plus for the New York Times. And, for all that you hear about mainstream media, legacy media, so forth, leaders, decision makers around the world still pick up the New York Times, in the morning on their phones, listen to the Daily, read our newsletters, all of the new forms of the New York Times, for one reason, which is it's got unparalleled reporting. And that's true whether you're discussing culture or foreign affairs or domestic affairs and so forth. So I never want to confuse the fact that people are talking to us and people are talking to me, and people are reading us because of the overall environment of the Times. And the Times has given me great leeway over the past 4 decades and a press pass to the world that I think is both a great responsibility, but also you wake up every day saying to yourself, how can I explain this set of events to readers who are busy and, on their way to work and commuting and so forth, and make sure they understand not only what's happening, but the dynamics behind it.
In addition to your 42 years, you have sort of a familial link to the New York Times radio, right? Back in the day.
Do. My grandfather, Elliot M. Sanger, was the co-founder of WQXR, which was the first classical music FM station, or one of the first in the country, and one of the biggest, and was owned by the Times from 1945 until probably 10 or 15 years ago. It's now part of New York Public Radio. But the result is that my grandfather sort of, by the time I was growing up, he was retired, but I was, hearing the stories of operating in and around the newsroom of the Times.
Yeah. So I'm curious, just in terms of the job that you have, you are, traveling with the president very often on Air Force One, you're attending conferences, speeches, and I think just trying to keep up. I mean, we were talking before the show, just in the last 72 hours, there's been this tumult in France over the leadership of the prime minister there. What you were referring to in South Korea, this declaration of martial law that seemed to catch everybody on their back foot globally. How do you even keep, I mean, those are people that we're thinking of as sort of stable allies of the United States.
Yeah. Well, there's not a whole lot stable in the world these days. And, I was at another World Affairs Council event last night, and I reminded everybody that the world that Donald Trump is about to go inherit in 6 weeks is very different from the world he left on January 20, 2021. And I'm not sure to what degree the new team has sort of absorbed those differences. I mean, the easy thing to say would be, it was all fine when we left and, Joe Biden messed it all up, and you can argue about what Biden was responsible for and what he wasn't. But the fact of the matter is the dynamics have changed considerably in the Mideast, with China in particular, certainly with Russia. The invasion of Ukraine was in February of 2022. So it was a year and a month after Biden came in. And that wasn't about Joe Biden. That was about Vladimir Putin. So the big question, I think, is how well do they land on their feet and get going? And, it helps in the fact that President Trump and his aides have been through this for 4 years, and they know a lot more than they knew when he came in after the 2016 election. But they may be surprised about how different the world looks to them today.
If you're just joining us, we are talking to New York Times White House and National Security Correspondent David Sanger. He's in town tonight as part of the World Affairs Council Global Issues Series. You can join our conversation as well. You can call us at 904-549-2937. You can also email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org or reach out on social media. So we noted you'll be speaking tonight, David, as part of a speaker series at UNF with the World Affairs Council. The topic of your book is going to be also the topic of your talk. It's titled The New Cold Wars. Talk to us about who is participating in the new Cold Wars. Why is it a plural? How is it different from the original Cold War?
Well, thanks, Anne, because that S is really important. The old Cold War was primarily a military competition, and within that, a nuclear competition with one adversary, the old Soviet Union. And while it had its terrifying moments, and while it had its proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam and so forth, over time, it settled into something of a predictable pattern. And after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, both sides were terrified enough that they settled into a world in which The United States understood that if it did X, the Soviet response would probably be Y. The Soviets had a similar understanding. There was a big red phone on either side. They had a pretty good thought that if they picked it up, someone would answer at the other end, and they'd probably know who the person was who was answering at the other end. And we were dependent on the old Soviet Union for nothing. Well, that's not true. Vodka and caviar, I think, could have been, two notable exceptions. But, if we had to live without them, we probably could figure out a way. The new Cold Wars are a completely different dynamic. We are obviously in a heated, direct conflict over Ukraine that we're trying to keep from spreading elsewhere, but which is increasingly worrisome. And we are in a multi-front competition that could well spill out into confrontation with China. China is the only country that can be our military, economic, cultural, and technological competitor. It's the only one that can really do that. And in many ways, one has to worry about the fact that our obsession with Putin's disruption can distract from the more subtle issues with China. And more worrisome than that is the two countries are now coming together. And that wasn't even evident to President Biden at the beginning of his administration. I asked him about it flat out at a press conference in maybe a year into his presidency, and he said, "Oh, David, these are two countries that have never gotten along. I don't think this is going to be an issue." By his last press conference, which was after the NATO conference in July and may turn out to be the last press conference of his presidency, I asked him if he had a policy of trying to get in the way of China and Russia, the way Nixon and Kissinger did in 1972 with the opening to China, which was motivated by an effort to divide China and the old Soviet Union. And he said, "Yes, I do, but I'm not going to tell you the details." Well, many of the details are in New Cold Wars. And this is a completely different dynamic. And in many ways, it's a far more dangerous dynamic because we don't understand the scope of the relationship between these two nuclear superpowers. Obviously, North Korea and Iran have sided with them in various ways. And it's becoming evident that with the end of globalization, we're getting a new Iron Curtain that is dropping. Some of it is digital, some of it's in trade, some of it is physical. But we're in for 30 or 40 years of confrontation, I argue in the book. And if you believe that, it changes everything you think about how much we're going to have to spend on defense, what our nuclear strategy is going to have to be, what our technology strategy is going to have to be, how artificial intelligence may affect the capabilities of all of these superpowers. And the book is an effort to try to get Americans to sort of get on the page about a new era that they're in.
You also talk about how there was a point during that period where perhaps countries didn't have to openly align with one or the other, that they could kind of play the middle field.
There are a lot of countries doing that right now.
But that is changing.
Well, look at India, which look at a close ally like Singapore. Small, but strategically very important. These are countries that say, and there's a chapter in the book that's titled this way, don't make me choose. In other words, don't make me choose between the China-Russia nexus and the United States. And you'll notice there are 50 or 60 countries that have joined the U.S.-European side of the Ukraine war. But there are 100 countries that haven't, and they're trying to, work both sides of it. They're selling oil to the Chinese. They don't want to get their business, in the way of this. Where this really comes down to confrontation, and is in technology. Because while you can sort of move between the two in most areas, when it comes to choosing whether you're going to have a U.S.-dominated or Western-dominated telecommunication system, or a China-Huawei-dominated one, whether it comes to whose chips you're going to buy, whether or not you're going to respect the U.S. export controls against Russia and China or not. When it comes to that, you basically have to choose. And countries are not comfortable with that. But that's the world we're headed into.
You talk about basically the full period of my adult life as a holiday from history. And I think that that's an interesting point to dig into a little bit. I mean, you described the period between the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and then the Russian invasion, um, as a kind of this lacuna between periods that are going to be very much defined by conflict. Uh, and I think that for a lot of people, they've sort of forgotten what it is like to live in a zone defined by that much international hostility.
Well, we've got a generation and a half of people who grew up, not in that era. So you've gotten to one of the reasons I wanted to write New Cold Wars. Um, 30 years ago this year, I came back from my happy life as a New York Times foreign correspondent in Asia. I was based in Japan for 6 years and traveling around Asia, and landed in Washington. This was October of 1994. And as I look back at that period now, there was one unchallenged assumption across parties around the city and really around the Western Alliance, which is that Russia and China, each for their own reasons, would basically join Western institutions. That China desperately wanted to be in the World Trade Organization because it needed to trade with the United States and its allies. That Russia was broke and on its back and just needed to keep the oil flowing to Europe because that was the only thing it had going that was revenue producing. And the theory was that this gave the sole superpower at the time, the United States, enormous powers to shape the world. And we acted that way for a while. I mean, we could lift bombers off in Nebraska and go drop ordnance in the war in Bosnia and Serbia, and have the pilots come back and land and go have dinner with their families. No other country had that kind of reach. There was, dismantlement of huge amounts of the nuclear arsenal. Not all of it, but we went from more than 10,000 weapons deployed on each side to 1,550. That's a big diminishment. People stopped thinking about nuclear weapons. I teach national security. Most students I get have never been in a course that dealt with nuclear strategy once in their lives, which would not have been the case. I'm revealing my advanced age here. When I was going to school in the late 70s and early 80s. So the question I wanted to ask in the book was, what happened here? Was this an intelligence failure? Was it wishful thinking? Was it that wonderful American capability to assume that every other country is driven by what we're driven by, which is profit motive? And therefore, as Donald Trump would frequently say in his first term, oh, yeah, they'll turn around because we're going to break them with sanctions and, it'll force them to come to the table. Well, how have those sanctions on Iran done since he pulled out of the deal? They've got closer to a nuclear weapon than they've ever been. How did it do with North Korea? They've got 60 nuclear weapons now. How did it do with China, which has learned how to evade U.S. sanctions? The Russians could hold a master class in avoiding sanctions and working their way around it. So we needed to have a real rethink. And the fact of the matter is that the past couple of years have shown we weren't a holiday from history.
There was this phrase, the end of history, that was bandied about and as you suggest, sort of embraced the idea that, all of these developments, whether it was globalization or technology, would sort of create a unified vision that would kind of override nationalism and override territorial ambitions.
That's right. Francis Fukuyama, I think, sort of coined that phrase in a foreign affairs article and then a book called The End of History, which basically suggested that everybody was moving toward liberal democracies. And first of all, he wasn't the only one. So, and he's a pretty brilliant scholar. So I'm not blaming him. And the second is, as I said, this was sort of a universally accepted thought. It just happened to be, as it turned out, completely wrong. Okay. And, South Korea, which we were discussing before, that was the great example of the end of history. I mean, here was a country that was a U.S. ally, but basically run by military dictators from the end of the Korean War up until the 1980s, when a increasingly wealthy and assertive populace took to the streets, ousted the autocrats, and made its conversion to a great democracy, and is now one of the most critical U.S. allies in dealing with China. And I think one of Biden's greatest accomplishments was actually bringing South Korea and Japan, which have, 150 years of or longer of historical animosity, actually hundreds of years of animosity, together in that effort. And then yesterday we had this like flashback for 6 hours to the past, where the president of South Korea declares martial law, not because of a great North Korea threat, although he made a vague reference to that, but because there's political gridlock with his National Assembly. And what happened? The uprising was so fast, and the markets were so poised to just pummel what is now the world's 12th largest economy. I mean, South Korea is no minor player in the world economy. And by the way, Samsung makes chips we can't make, right? And so is a critical supplier to us. And the martial law lasted 5.5, 6 hours. And on the one hand, that was a great triumph of democracy. On the other hand, it was like a reminder of how fragile democracies are.
When you talk about assumptions, like assumptions about, people divesting themselves of national identities, or, being incorrect about that end of history, you also in your book talk about other assumptions that we've made that were equally blind, whether it's, what would happen after we left Afghanistan, or the idea that Russians would not move beyond their existing borders to claim parts of Europe. What other assumptions are we making currently that you think are going to be problematic? Is it impossible to forecast what we're doing currently that is blind to the future?
Well, my forecasting abilities are pretty poor, particularly when it comes to American politics. So I'm not sure I'd be a great expert out there. But there are some things that I worry about for this. Number one, we assumed, and actually still do assume, that our supply chains of technology around the world and of critical parts are going to basically remain flowing. And we got a rude awakening during COVID, and maybe a good warning, when we suddenly discovered that things as basic as surgical masks and, N95s and all that, or even just the precursors that you need to make vaccines, we needed to get from abroad, and we suddenly couldn't get them. Remember those cars that would be lined up, in empty lots because there were certain chips you couldn't get for the dashboard, and therefore you couldn't sell the car. And that started, I think, a very admirable effort by the Biden administration to not only deprive China of the most advanced artificial intelligence related technology, chips, the chip making equipment, so that we could try to retain or gain more of a lead, but also to bring some of that home and to begin to build more chips in the United States. My criticism of the administration and of Congress in the book is that they're not moving anywhere near fast enough. And so if you're looking for an assumption that we're making right now that I worry about, we are assuming that China so needs the chips that are made in Taiwan by Taiwan Semiconductor, the largest, most highly capitalized company in Asia, and the most critical supplier for what's in your iPhone and for NVIDIA's AI chips and so forth. We're assuming that we're still going to have access to that. And it's a little bit of a crazy assumption. I mean, if they are building all of this because a series of U.S. companies made a series of business decisions with no national security thinking whatsoever, that we were going to move the manufacturing to a very efficient producer and just design the chips here in the United States. And it made every bit of economic sense. But if I came to you and said, here's an idea, let's take 90 to 95% of the most advanced chips that we need the most, and let's manufacture them on an island 100 miles off of China that the Chinese want back, you'd probably tell me that wasn't the brightest idea you ever heard. And in fact, it isn't. And we need to be moving at vastly, vastly greater speeds to get to the level of independence that we need.
If you're just joining us, we're talking to New York Times reporter David Sanger ahead of his appearance tonight in Jacksonville. You can join our conversation at 904-549-2937. You can also email First Coast Connect at WJCT.org. I want to take a call from Sally in Springfield. Good morning, Sally. Go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Sanger, for the work that you do. I have a question. And what is your perspective on President-elect Trump's recent talk about Canada becoming the next state for America? He posted an AI photo of him standing on the edge of a mountain next to a big Canadian flag, looking at supposedly the mountains of Canada. And I just wanted to address this, and especially since we're talking about assumptions that we have two peaceful allies, one above and one below. This kind of presentation or talk, whatever you want to call it, is unsettling.
I confess I did not see that tweet and have not seen a picture of.
Yeah, I'm just seeing that apparently he was joking with Justin Trudeau about annexing Canada.
Oh, was he? Okay. Well, you know, I'm a fly fisherman, and I can tell you that they've got some of the best trout streams around, but I don't think it's in the cards.
Yeah, all right. Fair enough. We've got a call from Susan in Mandarin. Good morning, Susan. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for that very clear example about the island and everything. But my question, and I hope other people want to know the answer to this also, but what would be a good use of tariffs? I know Adam Smith a long time ago in the 1700s was speaking out against tariffs because of the way that they were being used, but are there some good uses of tariffs? Thank you.
It's a really good question. So I think we have to look at this a couple of different ways. As I suggested at the beginning, China in particular is a military and economic and technological threat. And during the campaign, and for this I blame both campaigns, both the Harris campaign and the Trump campaign, there was absolutely no discussion, zero discussion of a broad grand strategy for how we want to go deal with China. And when it came up for President Trump, his answer to everything was tariffs. There are moments when you may want to use tariffs strategically to protect a burgeoning American industry. President Biden, who would describe himself as largely a free trader, although he'd probably say fair trader, put a 100% tariff on the import of Chinese-made automobiles. The Chinese cars aren't even here in the U.S. market yet. It was a preemptive tariff in order to keep the U.S. auto industry from suffering at the hands of subsidized and much lower cost Chinese goods. There was talk during the competition with Japan in the 1980s of putting tariffs on Japanese car parts, and there were some tariffs on specific things. We've seen tariffs used on Chinese-made solar panels along the way.
And you think those various examples were wise?
You can, at various moments, as a temporary measure, make that work if you are actively building up your own industry and if you believe that the other country is acting in a predatory way to basically destroy your industry before it gets going. And I can understand short-term uses. That's not what I understand President Trump is describing. He's describing broad tariffs that would be used against allies and adversaries. He's not talking about a specific time limit. And he's also not talking about what its inflationary effects would be. And frankly, I know the president says frequently that, it's the Chinese who pay the tariffs. It's not. It's you and me that pay the tariffs, right? Because that price increase goes right in. So when the inflation result of that begins to take off, my guess is that the consumer's enthusiasm for tariffs may wane a little bit.
But I mean, if you rescind tariffs, does that have any immediate impact, or does that inflationary effect just kind of kick in and remain?
It can, because manufacturers are accustomed to passing on a higher price, and they may just decide, well, we'll just, fatten our profits with it. So it's risky. The president does have, under U.S. law, extraordinary discretionary power to impose tariffs without Congress's assent.
So tonight you're going to be talking about your new book, The New Cold Wars, but I just want to talk a little bit about your previous book, The Perfect Weapon: War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age, because we've been hearing a lot lately about these various quote-unquote typhoons. That's the cyber name assigned to, hacks that originate in China.
Right.
So we're continuing to learn about the presence of some, malware or, invasion of all kinds of high-level systems, whether it's, infrastructure or emails and texts that the president or the future president may have sent or received. How broad is it? What do we know about the extent of this?
So, as The Perfect Weapon described, and that book came out in 2018, and there was an HBO documentary on it that we brought out in 2020 that your listeners may want to go dig up. If they have HBO, you can still find it there. That sort of describes the origins of how this came about. But cyber is the place where you conduct short of war aggression against other countries. And the two typhoons that we're most worried about right now, one of them, which the U.S. has been dealing with for the past year and a half, called Volt Typhoon, and one of them that is much more recent this summer called Salt Typhoon, really illustrate the differences. Volt Typhoon was an effort by the Chinese intelligence agencies to put code into the utility grid, into the water supply systems, and so forth, so that if there was ever a confrontation over Taiwan, they would have the power to turn off a good deal of the utility grid, slow our response. So that would be an offensive use of cyber to basically have a physical effect in the United States. Salt Typhoon is quite different. It's been an espionage effort that has gotten deep inside the U.S. telecommunications world and probably enabled the Chinese, among other things, to figure out which Chinese spies the United States was onto and wasn't, because they got into the court-approved system for doing surveillance.
Which could really put some people at risk if they're working.
That's right. Huge counterintelligence problem. And that gives you the scope, the amount of money, time, expertise the Chinese have put into this.
Brett Hester, I just want to bring you in briefly with the World Affairs Council. You obviously have David in tonight at 7 o'clock at UNF to talk about some of these issues. But what is it that he brings to this series that you guys are presenting?
Yeah, so the World Affairs Council, of course, exists to bring the world closer. And so we try to offer a broad range of topics that people are interested in. And obviously, what's going on in the world in relation to China and Russia, this is on the forefront of many of our listeners' minds. And so this is a great opportunity for you to come and hear from one of those leading voices. And we encourage people to go to our website, worldaffairscounciljax.org. They can find tickets. It's free and open to the public, but we certainly hope that people will take a look as well at our membership options so that they can hear not only from David, but from other speakers that we have in our lineup throughout the season.
And David, you're going to be speaking and then also signing books?
That's what I understand, and it's really great to be back. I haven't actually spoken back in Jacksonville since my second book came out in around 2010, 2011, so it's It's been a while, and it's great to be back, and I'm really delighted that we're going to have a lot of students there in particular.
Well, it's great to talk to you. David Sanger, thank you so much for being here. Brett Hester, thanks for coming as well.
Thank you, Ann.
Coming up, we catch up with Barrett Smith, bassist and singer for Asheville-based bluegrass favorites Steep Canyon Rangers, ahead of their Friday's performance at the Florida Theater. Welcome back. From their roots as a North Carolina college band to their Grammy-winning albums and performances alongside comic Steve Martin, the Steep Canyon Rangers have become both iconic bluegrass performers and renowned musical innovators. Barrett Smith, upright bassist and vocalist for Steep Canyon Rangers, joins me now. Good morning, Barrett.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. You're from Asheville, and we should probably just start with an update in terms of how things are there now. How were you impacted?
Yeah, it's been quite a time up here. There's still a lot of work to be done, still a lot of recovery happening. Like a lot of the city was impacted, not in such a devastating way like the things you've seen on screens. There was a lot of that, but there's a lot of the city that instead maybe just had some minor damage. And we lost running water for a long time and power for a long time. Other than that, we're in a position where we could get out and help the areas that were more violently hit, which everybody, saw, of course. And it's all in recovery. It's all happening. And like the best thing anybody can do, people from outside of Asheville have been so helpful. And it's been very heartwarming. And now it's just time to take a trip to Asheville. That's what's up.
Yeah,
That's a
I'm
great
sure.
place to visit, and tourism is our thing, and we're ready for people to come back. And the city, in a lot of ways, is better than it ever was.
So your music is a blend of traditional and contemporary bluegrass, but there's several members in the band. What is the writing process? How does it begin, and who sort of carries the vocal torch, and who's doing the bulk of the music writing?
Good question. Yeah, it's a unique situation in that we have two guys who do the bulk of the writing. That's Graham Sharp, who's the banjo player and he sings, and Aaron Burdett, our newest member, who plays guitar and sings. They basically bring a song to the band is how it typically goes, and the band has for all of these years turned into this kind of song processing, arranging machine. So they kind of stick the song in the machine and hope for the best, and then we deconstruct and reconstruct and flip everything around, lots of suggestions and lots of playing and having fun with it. And then at some point it comes out as a Steep Canyon Rangers song.
And so the music of the bluegrass roots that you draw from, they draw from Appalachia and the Piedmont region, which are distinct and I guess have their own unique musical heritage. Describe a little bit, if you can, how those come together, how they resemble each other, or how they're different.
As far as pure bluegrass goes, if we're talking about North Carolina, I mean, North Carolina has a lot of roots music that's not bluegrass, and a lot of that you find in the Piedmont blues and such. The traditions that we pull from more, namely bluegrass, I would say that up here in our western North Carolina area, you get a little more of a feel of what they would call old-time music, which is really like this kind of pre-bluegrass, old-timey thing that bluegrass sprouted out of. And it's just kind of what it sounds like. It's old-timey. It's old-time music. And it's like what Mark Twain said about opera. It's like it's better than it sounds. So it's kind of like, think about like...
incorporate so many other sounds into the work that you do, though. I mean, you have jazz influences, rock. What is your own musical base? Like, how did it form? And what did you come to the band with and wanting to do?
Yeah. So I joined the band probably, like 7 years ago or so. The band's been together for like 20-something years, so it's this long-standing thing. I personally came in from a bluegrass area. That's like what I had been spending most of my time doing is playing in bluegrass bands and classical music music that people wanted to hear and have a good time. And I wanted to party and have a good time, so I started playing bluegrass music. So there's that. And I mean, everybody in the band comes with a pretty unique kind of skill set and knowledge base musically. And it makes a pretty cool stew when you put it all together.
So your previous album was Morning Shift, but you've most recently recorded an entirely live album. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about it, where it was recorded, and some of the songs on it.
We've just done a million studio albums. It's so many going back all those years, and we're real proud of them. But we got to a point after the Morning Shift album where we realized, like, man, live music is what we do, and we're real proud of the show we put on. It's just a great time. And we looked around and said, wait a second, if somebody looks up Steve Canyon Rangers on Spotify or something, they pull up these studio albums, and it's a representation of what we are, but it's not a really accurate representation of what we do all the time, and we love what we do all the time. So let's make an album that's just us playing live. So we really just took some recording equipment to a show, turned it into an album, and it's one of those really special places. We've got a handful of them that we've developed over the years. The Florida Theater in Jacksonville is one that's right at the beginning of that whole process, where it's like when we've done it once or twice, it's a sweet spot, which is the song. We all kind of together wrote the song Sweet Spot. And it's the second song on that Greenfield Lake live album. And we play it almost every show, or every show at least, where we're in a really sweet spot, because it feels good to say, like, all right, look how lucky we all are to be here in this place, having a good time and sharing music. I'd say Sweet Spot's one of my favorite songs from that album. We really want people to come out to downtown Jacksonville for this show. It's such a cool spot that's right there in the middle of this big city.
So we'll hear a little bit of Sweet Spot when we close out this interview, but we should say you are performing at the Florida Theater on Friday, and people can get ticket information at floridatheater.com. But I would be negligent not to ask you about something I'm sure you get asked about a lot, which is working alongside comic Steve Martin, which is a way that a lot of people actually get to know your band, sometimes for the first time. So what is that collaboration like for you? Do you tire of people asking about that, as opposed to the other stuff and the many, many things that Steve Canyon Rangers has done over the years?
It's never get tired of it, because it's such a cool collaboration and friendship. I mean, at this point, we've been doing it together for, I don't know, like 15 years, maybe. We've been working together, which strangely is like, I don't know, maybe it's Steve Martin's longest standing collaboration with somebody. I don't know, which is crazy to say. But it's a deep relationship and a lot of love and respect back and forth. And so I definitely never get tired of talking about it. It's just it's an honor to hang out with such an iconic entertainment person, such a great mind. And these days when we play with Steve, it's almost always Steve Martin and Martin Short. It's like a stage show, and it's hilarious and wonderful. And Marty also is a real gem of a human. So to get to hang out with those two guys so much.
Out of my way, through the eye of the needle, to the other side. Get your motor running, not too high. Yeah, find a little sweet spot, just let it ride. Yeah, find a little sweet spot.
The Gainesville Big Band presents Duke Ellington's Nutcracker Suite, featuring festive jazz and swing, Sunday, December 8th, 2 p.m. at Maison Church by Santa Fe College. More at GainesvilleBigBand.com, funded by Visit Gainesville, Alachua County. The North Florida TPO is committed to shaping our transportation future. We're focused on planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, connected community. Learn more at northfloridatpo.com.
About 40 million Americans have left churches and other religious institutions in the last 25 years, but the reasons why may be a lot more boring than you'd expect.
Most people have left for really pedestrian reasons, like I moved, attendance was inconvenient, or say family changed.
So what does that say about the importance of faith in America? That's on the next On Point.
Today at 11, here on WJCT News 89.9.
Donald Trump has rolled out high-level appointments at a dizzying speed. On the next Fresh Air, we talk with economist David Wessel about the team he's picked and what to expect from his plans to raise tariffs, cut taxes, deport immigrants, slash spending, and abolish thousands of government regulations. Join us.
Today at noon on WJCT News 89.9.
The president-elect has made no secret about how much he loves tariffs.
To me, I think it's the most beautiful word in the dictionary.
Weeks before taking office, Donald Trump is doubling down on his tariff plan. But will it bring back jobs to the U.S.? I'm Jen White. Next time on 1A, we hear what it could mean for you, the economy, and global trade.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. Well, it's a new day for arts and culture in Nassau County. Here to tell us about a new name, mission, and creative trajectory is Richard Restiano. He's president of the Nassau Council of Arts and Culture Incorporated. Hey, Richard, welcome back.
Hey, thanks, Ann. Thanks for giving us the opportunity.
Absolutely. So you were on the program in May. You were advocating for the designation of this newly formulated council, and so that has been approved by the County Commission in Nassau County.
So what we did was we pretty much reinvented the idea of an arts and culture organization. Previously, we were as a county commission last year. That had its limitations in its structure and its 15-year history.
It was under the arm of the county commission.
That's right. So to make changes to be more liberated into generating funds, collecting donations, adding volunteers, and having a vision that reaches the whole county, the only way to do that was to dissolve that, which we did last December, and form the nonprofit, which I did in January and February.
And so the county commission has now designated this what's known as an LAA, a local arts agency, and that basically gives you some power to seek grants and develop programs.
Right. It gives that will vote on arts and culture, and you have an ability to speak to them, have a presence, and get what you think makes a lot of sense to grow the arts business and community in Nassau. You know, we've got such a small group throughout the mainland off Amelia Island, and such a very well formed group on Amelia Island. You know, what our mission is now to, if we're not going to try to move these folks, but what we want to do is we want to create the same kind of energy and immediacy in the county outside of the island.
And for people who aren't really familiar with the geography, Amelia Island obviously is an island. It's on the eastern side of Nassau County, traditional kind of base of Fernandina Beach, a lot of development. But the western county, which includes places like Yulee, has grown a great deal in recent years.
Oh, absolutely. And I think one of the drivers, aside from the limitations of the previous organization, was the immediate and potential growth in Mid-County. So when you have Wildlight active in its building of a development, you have Callahan building up in their neck of the woods. What we needed to do is create a way to bridge the arts groups down on the island and create an arts group up in the Callahan area. So what we're looking to do is actually create a West Side Arts Alliance that can join in with the arts community on the island and have a better integration, bringing the arts to the whole county.
So Nassau probably hasn't traditionally been considered, a hub of arts and culture. It's a rural county until very recently. It was a pretty small county, although that is changing with a lot of booming development. So what role does art and culture play in Nassau County?
Well, it's really interesting. The county has been very good in working on their 25th Side Arts Alliance, getting all those independent artists together as an organization, and then building on that to have a better presence. In Yulee, we have the historic preservation. We're working with them to set up a historic park to make Yulee have a sense of pride of place, historic.
Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. Congaree & Penn, dedicated to agriculture and culinary endeavors, offering field-to-fork dining and outdoor experiences on over 300 acres. Sip, dine, explore. Information at congareeandpenn.com. The Florida Star newspaper has turned 72 years old and is still serving communities as a thoughtful small business. You won't believe what we are doing next. Stay in the know by picking up a Florida Star newspaper or logging on to thefloridastar.com.